What happens when the two worlds you've been keeping separate collide in the worst possible way? Not slowly, not gently, but all at once in a single moment where there's no time to prepare, no way to explain, no chance to control how you're seen. That was the moment everything I had built in silence was suddenly exposed to the one person whose opinion mattered most. My name is Cora Clark, and I was standing in my parents' kitchen, trying to keep up with a dinner for 50 guests, when Christopher Hayes walked back into my life, not as a name on a screen, but as a presence in the room. I had just returned from refilling drinks, my hands still damp, my thoughts scattered between tasks that never seemed to end. The kitchen felt smaller now, crowded, not with people, but with everything I hadn't had time to process. And then he was there, not announced, not introduced, just present. He stepped into the doorway with the same quiet confidence I remembered from our meeting, but this time the context was completely different. There was no presentation, no structured conversation, no clear roles. Just me in an apron in a space that didn't reflect who I was outside of it. "Those look excellent," he said, gesturing toward the food. His tone was calm, observant, not exaggerated, not performative. I nodded, slightly unsure of how to respond, aware of every detail that suddenly felt out of place. "You made all of this yourself?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady even as everything inside me tightened. There was a brief pause, not uncomfortable but intentional, like he was taking in more than just the answer. "Impressive," he said again, but this time it carried more weight. Then he introduced himself formally as if we hadn't already spoken in a completely different setting. "Christopher Hayes." I felt the shift immediately, not just in recognition but in reality. The man who had evaluated my work, who had seen my ideas in their strongest form, was now seeing me in a moment where none of that was visible. And for a second, I didn't know which version of me he believed. I shook his hand, grounding myself in the one thing that hadn't changed: my name. Cora Clark. His eyes held mine a fraction longer than expected. Not questioning, not confused, just aware. "You work in design, if I remember correctly," he said. "I do," I answered, and I wanted to say more. I wanted to explain the context, to bridge the gap between what he had seen before and what he was seeing now. But before I could, the moment was interrupted. "Cora, we need more wine." My mother's voice cut through the space without hesitation, without awareness, without pause. It wasn't directed at me as a person. It was directed at a role, a function, something expected to respond immediately. I felt the heat rise in my chest, not from embarrassment, but from the sudden realization of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was the reality of how I was seen in my own family. I glanced at him, briefly searching for something: judgment, confusion, disappointment. But what I found instead was something unexpected. Focus. He wasn't reacting the way I feared he would. He wasn't dismissing me. If anything, he seemed more attentive, more present, like he was observing a situation that didn't align with what he already knew. "Excuse me," I said, stepping away. Not because I wanted to, but because I had been conditioned to respond. As I moved through the house carrying out another task, I felt the weight of that moment follow me. It wasn't just that he had seen me like this. It was that he had seen both versions of me at once, the one who built something valuable and the one who was treated as if she had nothing. When I returned to the kitchen, he was no longer there. The space felt emptier, but the impact remained. Because something had changed. Not in how I was being treated, but in how I was seeing it. The contrast was undeniable now. The gap between who I was and who I was allowed to be in that house had never been clearer. And for the first time, I wasn't trying to close that gap. I was starting to question why it existed at all. There are moments that don't look important when they happen. Quiet, almost invisible, easily missed if you're not paying attention. But later you realize they were the turning point. The exact second everything began to change. That moment for me didn't come with a confrontation or a decision. It came in the middle of the kitchen, with my phone lighting up, while my hands were still wet from washing dishes. "My name is Cora Clark." And while the noise of the party carried through the house, while laughter filled every room and conversations overlapped without pause, I stood there staring at a single line of text that felt heavier than everything else around me. It was an email notification. Simple, easy to ignore. But something about it made me stop. I dried my hands slowly, almost instinctively, like I needed to create a small pause before opening it, as if I already knew that whatever was inside would matter. I tapped the screen. The subject line was clear, direct, unmistakable. Contract ready for signature. For a second, everything else disappeared. The sound of the party, the pressure of the tasks, the expectations waiting just outside that kitchen door, all of it faded into the background. Because in that moment I wasn't standing in my parents' house anymore. I was standing in the space I had built for myself, the one that existed beyond their assumptions, beyond their definitions. I opened the email, my eyes scanning quickly, almost too quickly, trying to confirm what I already believed to be true. And there it was. The number. $240,000. Not a draft. Not a possibility. Not something conditional. A finalized contract. Approved. Ready. Real. I read it again, then again. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to feel it settle into something I could trust. 240,000. It wasn't just a number. It was proof. Proof that everything I had done in silence had value. Proof that the hours, the focus, the discipline, the belief I had held onto when no one else did, had led somewhere real. I leaned back slightly against the counter, my breathing, slowing my thoughts shifting from reaction to clarity. For the first time that day, I wasn't thinking about what needed to be done next. I wasn't anticipating the next request, the next interruption, the next expectation. I was just present, fully aware of where I was and what I had achieved. And then, just as quickly the contrast returned, I could hear my mother's voice from the other room calling my name. I could hear the movement of guests, the clinking of glasses, the ongoing rhythm of a space where I was still expected to play the same role I had always played. Nothing had changed out there. The world beyond that kitchen was still operating under the same assumptions. I was still the one with time, the one who could be called, the one who would respond. But something inside me had shifted, because now I was holding something undeniable, something that didn't depend on their recognition, something that existed whether they saw it or not. I looked down at my phone again at the email, still open at the confirmation that everything I had been working toward was now within reach. And for the first time, I asked myself a different question. Not what do they need from me, but what do I need from myself? The answer wasn't immediate. It didn't come in a clear sentence or a dramatic realization. It came as a quiet awareness that settled into place slowly but firmly. I couldn't keep living in two realities. I couldn't keep shrinking one version of myself to fit into a space that didn't recognize it. Because the more I did that, the more I erased the very thing I had worked so hard to build. I locked my phone, placing it face down on the counter, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't need to keep checking. It was real. It wasn't going anywhere. And for the first time, I felt something stronger than exhaustion, stronger than frustration, stronger than the need to be understood. I felt certainty. Not loud, not overwhelming, just steady, clear, unshakable. The kind of certainty that doesn't come from being told you're valuable, but from seeing it for yourself. I picked up the next plate, continuing the work I had been doing all day. But something was different now. The actions were the same. The environment was the same. But I wasn't the same. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew that everything they believed about me was about to be proven wrong. What happens when the truth you've been carrying in silence finally slips out? Not in a dramatic announcement, not in a perfect moment, but in the middle of pressure, frustration, and everything you've been holding back for far too long. That's how it happened. Not planned, not controlled, just real. My name is Cora Clark, and I was standing in the kitchen surrounded by heat, noise, and expectations when my sister walked in with urgency written all over her face. The main course, Madison said, her voice tight, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the stress underneath. It needs to go out now. I glanced at the timer. It wasn't ready. Not yet. It needs a few more minutes, I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. If I take it out now, it won't be done properly. She didn't want to hear that. She didn't have space for it. Then figure something else out, she said, frustration rising. These are important people. Important. The word hung in the air. Familiar, heavy, always used to justify pressure that didn't belong to me. I took a breath, trying to stay calm. I understand that. But food takes the time it takes. She pressed her fingers against her temple, exhaling sharply. Why do you always make things so difficult? That question landed harder than it should have. Not because it was new, but because it wasn't true. I wasn't making anything difficult. I was the one making everything work. The one adjusting, adapting, carrying the weight of decisions that were never mine to begin with. I'm not making this difficult, I said quietly. I'm trying to do it right. There was a pause. A brief moment where something shifted in her expression, not understanding, not yet, but something close to awareness. Then it passed. Just bring out the salad early, she said. Buy us time. I nodded because that's what I had always done. I adjusted. I adapted. I solved the problem. But something inside me was already changing. As I turned back to the counter, she spoke again, more casually this time, as if the tension had never existed. You always overthink things, she added. It's not like you're dealing with real pressure. That was the moment. Not loud, not explosive, but precise. Final. Something in me went completely still. Do you know what I'm working on right now? I asked, turning to face her. She barely looked at me. I don't have time for this, she said. Just handle it. I held her gaze even when she didn't return it. A contract, I said. That got her attention. She turned just slightly. What kind of contract? The question was casual. Dismissive. Like she was expecting something small, something easy to categorize. Something that would fit into the version of me she already believed in. A big one, I replied. She shrugged, already half turning away. How big that was it? The moment where everything could stay hidden, or finally be seen. $240,000. The words landed between us heavier than anything else in that room. For the first time, she stopped completely, turned back fully, looked at me, not past me, not through me, but at me. What I didn't repeat it immediately. I let the silence do its work, let the meaning settle, let the gap between what she believed and what was real become visible. 240,000, I said again, calm, steady, certain. Full brand development contract. Her expression changed in a way I had never seen before. Not just surprise, not just disbelief, it was recalculation. Everything she thought she knew about me shifting, adjusting, trying to make sense of something that didn't fit. Meridian, she asked, her voice quieter now. Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. Heavier. When did this happen? She asked. I've been working on it for weeks, I said. I told you I was busy. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. Because the truth was already doing the work for me. She looked down for a moment, processing, then back at me. I didn't know it was that serious. I nodded slightly. You didn't ask. Silence filled the space between us, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one wasn't empty. It was full of realization, full of everything that had been overlooked, dismissed, ignored. For the first time, she was seeing me differently. Not because I had changed, but because the truth had finally become impossible to ignore. And standing there in that same kitchen, in the same space, where I had been reduced to something smaller, just hours before I realized something important. I hadn't needed to prove anything. I had just needed to stop hiding it. If you've ever had to stay silent while being underestimated, hit like, you're not alone. And subscribe. Because what happens next is when everything finally starts to shift. What do you do when the truth is finally out and nothing changes? Not the tone, not the expectations, not the way people treat you. You would think that a revelation, something undeniable, something that rewrites everything, would shift the dynamic instantly. But sometimes the hardest part isn't being unseen, it's being seen, and still expected to stay the same. My name is Cora Clark, and I had just told my sister the truth. Not a version of it, not something softened or explained away. The full weight of it. A contract worth $240,000. Something real. Something that should have mattered. And for a moment it did. I saw it in her face, the shock, the recalculation, the silent recognition that what she believed about me didn't align with reality anymore. It was there, clear as anything I had ever seen. But then just as quickly, it shifted. Not back to what it was before. Not entirely, but enough. Enough to reveal something I hadn't fully understood until that moment. You're still going to serve right? She asked. Her voice wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't dismissive in the same way. It was quieter. Almost careful. But the question itself hadn't changed. I stared at her not because I didn't hear her, but because I did. Completely. Fully. And what I heard wasn't just a request. It was an expectation that had survived even the truth. "There are people waiting," she added, gesturing toward the other room. "This needs to go well." I followed her gaze for a second toward the sound of conversation, toward the space where everything was still unfolding as if nothing had happened. Because for them, nothing had. The party was still the priority. The image was still intact. The roles were still in place. And I was still standing in the same position I had been in all day. The only difference was that now I knew something they didn't, or rather, something they hadn't accepted yet. "You need this to go well," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was a recognition. She nodded, tension returning to her posture. Yes, that one word carried everything. Her career, her reputation, the pressure she had been under long before I stepped into that kitchen. And for a second I understood her. Not the way she had treated me, not the assumptions she had made, but the pressure, the fear of failure, the need to maintain control when everything felt uncertain. And that understanding made the moment more complicated. Because part of me wanted to help. The part of me that always helped, the part that had been trained over years to respond, to adjust, to step in, without being asked. But another part of me was tired. Not physically, not just from the hours of work or the weight of the day, but tired of being the solution to problems that were never mine. Tired of being the person everyone relied on, without ever being recognized as someone who had her own life, her own priorities, her own limits. I looked at the food in front of me, the result of everything I had done that day. It was good. More than good. It was exactly what it needed to be. And for a moment I imagined what it would feel like to just stop, to set everything down, to walk away from the expectations, the roles, the unspoken agreements that had defined my place in that family for so long. But I didn't. Not yet. "I'll bring it out," I said finally. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, relief flickering across her face, but before she could turn away, I added something I had never said before. "This is the last time." She paused, not fully turning back, but not moving forward either. "What?" "The last time I do this," I said, my voice calm, steady, without anger. "Not because I can't, but because I shouldn't have to." The words didn't land like an argument. They didn't escalate the moment. They just existed, clear and undeniable, a boundary, not loud, not dramatic, but real. She didn't respond immediately, and in that silence I realized something important. Change doesn't always happen in the moment you expect it to. Sometimes it starts quietly with a single decision that shifts the direction of everything that comes after. I picked up the plate, moving toward the door, stepping back into the role I had been playing all day, but not in the same way. Because now it wasn't automatic. It wasn't assumed. It was chosen. And that made all the difference. There's a point where staying silent costs more than speaking up. Not because you suddenly become brave, but because the weight of everything you've been holding in becomes impossible to carry any longer. That was the moment I reached my limit. Not gradually, not over time, but all at once, in a room full of people who had no idea what was about to happen. My name is Cora Clark, and after everything that had built up throughout the day, the exhaustion, the dismissal, the truth finally spoken, I walked out of the kitchen and into the living room, not as the person they expected me to be, but as someone who had nothing left to hide. The room was still full, still alive with conversation and laughter, but something shifted the moment I stepped in. Maybe it was the way I moved. Maybe it was the fact that I wasn't carrying anything this time. No tray, no glass, no task to complete. Just myself. "Mom," I said, my voice cutting through the noise more clearly than I expected. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Conversation slowed, then stopped. Faces turned. Attention gathered in a way I had never experienced before in that space. For once, I wasn't invisible. "Can we talk?" I added, even though I already knew this wasn't going to be a private conversation. My mother smiled automatically, the kind of practiced expression meant to maintain control. "Not now, honey," she said lightly. "We have guests." The same answer, the same dismissal, the same pattern. But this time I didn't step back. No, I said, and even I felt the difference in that single word. Not defensive, not emotional, just final. The room went quieter, not completely silent, but enough that every word mattered now. We need to talk now. My father shifted slightly uncomfortable. Madison froze where she stood, and for the first time I could see something new in their expressions. Not authority, not certainty. Uncertainty. Because I wasn't following the script anymore. Cora, my mother, said, her voice tighter now, her smile fading just enough to reveal irritation underneath. You're making a scene. I looked around the room at the people watching, at the space I had spent the entire day preparing. No, I said calmly. This is the scene. That landed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. A few people shifted. Someone glanced down at their glass. Someone else looked toward the door as if considering leaving. The illusion was cracking. I've been working since early this morning, I continued. Cooking, cleaning, preparing everything you see here. Not because I was asked, but because I was expected to. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me. Because for years I had imagined this moment going differently. Messier, louder, harder to control. But it wasn't. It was precise. And the entire time I added, I've been treated like I don't have a life outside of this house. My mother opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't stop. Not this time. You told people my work was little freelance projects. A ripple moved through the room. Subtle but undeniable. People had heard that. They remembered. You said I'd grow out of it, I continued. That it wasn't a real job. I let the silence stretch just long enough for the words to settle. That's not true. My father stepped forward slightly. Cora, let's not do this here. Where should we do it? I asked, turning to him. Privately. Like every other time something uncomfortable comes up, he didn't answer. Because there wasn't one. I looked back at my mother. You don't get to decide when this conversation is convenient. The words were simple, but they carried something new. Boundaries. Not as an idea, not as something abstract, but as something real. Something that existed, whether they accepted it or not. I'm not doing this anymore, I said. Not the silence. Not the role. Not the version of me that only exists to make everything easier for everyone else. Madison took a step toward me, her voice lower now, almost pleading. Cora, please. Not like this. I met her gaze. There isn't another way. Because there wasn't. Not after everything that had happened. Not after everything I had allowed for so long. The room was completely still now. No one was pretending not to listen anymore. No one was looking away. For the first time, everything was exactly what it was. Uncomfortable, honest, real. And standing there in the center of it, I realized something I had never fully understood before. Speaking up doesn't guarantee things will change immediately. It doesn't fix what's broken in a single moment. But it does one thing that silence never can. It changes you. And once that happens, there's no going back. What if walking away wasn't the end, but the first real beginning of your life? Not a dramatic escape, not a moment of anger, but a quiet, irreversible decision where you finally choose yourself. That's what it felt like when I took my first step toward the door. My name is Cora Clark, and after everything that had been said, after the silence that followed, after years of being the person who stayed no matter what, I was about to leave. Not the house, not just the party, but the version of myself that had kept me there for far too long. The room was still watching me. You could feel it in the air, attention without movement, expectation without words. No one knew what I was going to do. Maybe they thought I would calm down. Maybe they thought I would apologize. Maybe they thought I would step back into the role I had always played. That's what I had always done before. But this time, I didn't move toward the kitchen. I didn't reach for another task. I reached for the door. My mother's voice came first. If you walk out, don't expect to come back. The words landed behind me, sharp, final, meant to stop me, meant to pull me back into the same pattern that had always worked before. For a second, I paused, not because I was unsure, but because I needed to feel the weight of that moment fully. Everything I had been taught about family loyalty, obligation, it all lived inside that sentence. Don't leave. Don't disrupt. Don't choose yourself over us. I turned back slowly, meeting her eyes. Okay, I said. Just one word. No anger, no hesitation, just acceptance. The silence that followed was louder than anything that had come before, because that wasn't the answer she expected. It wasn't resistance. It wasn't negotiation. It was a boundary. And boundaries don't argue. They don't explain. They simply exist. I could see it in her expression, the confusion, the disbelief, the sudden realization that something fundamental had shifted, that the control she had always relied on wasn't working anymore. My father stepped forward slightly, his voice softer, more measured. "Cora, let's be reasonable." I looked at him looked at him not as the authority figure I had grown up with, but as someone who had never asked the right questions. "I've been reasonable for years," I said, "and it brought me here." There was no accusation in my voice, just truth. Madison's voice came next, strained, uncertain. "You're ruining everything." I shook my head gently. "No," I said, "I'm just not fixing it anymore." That was the difference. For them, everything was falling apart. For me, things were finally becoming clear. I reached for the door handle, my hand steady, my breath even. There was no rush, no urgency, just a quiet certainty that this was the right decision. Not easy, not painless, but necessary. I opened the door, and for a moment, the outside air felt different. Cooler. Lighter. Like stepping into a space where I could finally exist without being defined by someone else's expectations. Behind me, the room remained frozen. No one followed. No one stopped me. And that told me everything I needed to know. Because if they had truly seen me, truly understood what this moment meant, they wouldn't have let me leave like that. But they didn't. And maybe that was the final confirmation I needed. I stepped outside, closing the door gently behind me, not as an act of anger, but as a decision, a separation, a line drawn clearly for the first time. The sound of the party disappeared, almost instantly replaced by a quiet that felt unfamiliar, but right. I stood there for a second, letting it settle, letting myself feel what I had just done. Fear, relief, uncertainty, freedom, all at once. And then I moved forward, not looking back, not hesitating. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking toward myself. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect, comment "I choose myself." Hit like if this moment resonates with you, and subscribe, because what happens next will show you why that one step changed everything. What happens after you walk away is often more revealing than the moment you leave. Not because everything suddenly falls apart, but because the truth you exposed doesn't disappear when you're gone. It lingers. It spreads. It forces people to face what they've been avoiding. That's exactly what happened the night I left. My name is Cora Clark, and while I was driving away from the house, trying to process what I had just done, everything behind me was beginning to unravel in ways no one had expected. At first, there was confusion, that kind of awkward, unsettled energy that fills a room when something breaks the rhythm and no one knows how to fix it. My mother tried to recover quickly, stepping into the silence with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "She's just overwhelmed," she said to the guests, her voice light, controlled, as if she could smooth everything over with the right tone. "You know how creative people can be." A few people nodded politely. Some accepted the explanation because it was easier than questioning it. But others had heard too much, seen too much. The illusion had cracked, and once that happens, it's impossible to restore things to exactly what they were before. Madison stepped in next, trying to take control of the situation. She moved toward the dining area, her posture composed, her expression carefully neutral. "Dinner is ready," she announced, as if nothing had happened. As if the moment in the living room could simply be erased by continuing the schedule. But it didn't work the way she hoped. Because suddenly everything required effort. Serving food, coordinating timing, managing guests, all the things I had been doing without recognition now became visible through their absence. Plates were delayed, courses overlapped, conversations became shorter, more fragmented. The energy in the room shifted from relaxed to strained. People began to notice, not just the logistics, but the dynamic. The gap between what had been said and what was being done. Madison tried to handle it all herself at first, but it didn't take long for the pressure to show. A tray slipped from her hands at one point, the sound cutting through the room like a sharp reminder that control was fragile. Someone rushed to help. Another guest stood awkwardly nearby, unsure whether to intervene or step back. The polished image they had built was starting to break in real time. My father moved between groups, trying to keep conversations going, but even he couldn't ignore the shift. The easy confidence he had earlier was gone, replaced by something more forced, more uncertain, because the narrative had changed, and he didn't know how to adjust to it. Then there was Christopher Hayes. He hadn't left. That alone said something. He stayed not as a passive observer, but as someone who understood exactly what had just happened. He didn't intervene immediately. He didn't create a scene. He simply watched, listened, took in the details that others might have missed. And when most of the guests had started to leave, when the room had thinned enough that the noise no longer covered the tension, he spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that the people who remained could hear every word. He addressed my father first, not as a guest, but as someone speaking from a position of knowledge. "We need to talk about your daughter," he said. My father began to apologize, assuming the conversation would be about what had happened earlier. But Hayes stopped him. "I'm not talking about her behavior," he said. "I'm talking about her work." That was the moment everything shifted again. Because now the truth wasn't coming from me. It was coming from someone they respected. Someone whose opinion carried weight, in a way mine never had. He explained the contract, the scope, the value, $240,000. Not as a surprise, not as something exaggerated, but as a fact. A reality that had existed long before that night, whether they had recognized it or not. The room went quiet, not the polite silence from earlier, a different kind. One filled with realization, with recalculation, with the slow understanding that everything they had assumed had been wrong, and in that moment, the narrative they had built about me collapsed completely. Not because I had argued against it, but because the truth had become undeniable, and that's what people don't always expect. Walking away doesn't end the story. Sometimes, it's the moment that forces everyone else to finally see it. What happens when the truth doesn't just stay in one room, but follows people everywhere they go, not as a rumor, not as gossip, but as a consequence. Because once something real is exposed, it doesn't quietly disappear. It reshapes how people are seen, how they're judged, how they're remembered. That's what happened after that night. My name is Cora Clark. And while I was finally experiencing a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years, my family was facing something they had never had to confront before. The reality of how they had treated me reflected back at them through everyone else's eyes. It started small, subtle shifts in tone, conversations that didn't feel the same. The kind of social signals people pretend not to notice, but always understand. My mother's usual confidence began to falter. The spaces where she had once felt comfortable, her social circles, her routines no longer responded the same way. People were polite, but there was distance, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. Because now they knew. Not everything, not every detail, but enough. Enough to question the version of events they had been presented with. My father experienced it differently. Not directly, not emotionally, but through absence, invitations that didn't come, plans that quietly changed, conversations that ended a little too quickly. It wasn't confrontation, it was something more subtle, recognition, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. And then there was Madison. For her, the shift was immediate, tangible. The professional world she had worked so hard to build suddenly reflected something she hadn't prepared for, not her achievements, not her capabilities, but her judgment. Because leadership isn't just about success, it's about how you see people, how you treat them. And once that question is raised, it doesn't go away easily. She was called into a meeting, not accusatory, not harsh, but direct, clear. Her work wasn't the issue. Her performance wasn't the problem. It was something else. Something deeper. The way she had handled that night. The assumptions she had made. The way she had spoken, not in private, but in front of people who understood the weight of those actions. The conversation wasn't about punishment. It was about reflection, about growth, about whether she could see what had gone wrong. Because in positions of responsibility, awareness matters as much as skill. Her path didn't end, but it changed, slowed, redirected, not because she wasn't capable, but because something essential had been called into question. And that kind of shift takes time to repair. Outside of those immediate circles, the story took on a life of its own, not exaggerated, not distorted, but shared, observed, interpreted. A reminder that the way you treat people, especially those closest to you, doesn't stay hidden forever. Someone who had been there that night shared their perspective, not naming names, not pointing fingers directly, just describing what they had seen. A talented, hardworking person being dismissed, reduced, overlooked. And then standing up for herself. The response was immediate, not because people love conflict, but because they recognize truth when they see it. Conversations started, opinions formed, not just about me, but about them, about what it means to value someone, about what it means to ignore that value. And suddenly the narrative my family had controlled for years wasn't theirs anymore. It had shifted into something they couldn't manage, couldn't reshape, couldn't dismiss, because it didn't belong to them. It belonged to everyone who had witnessed it. And for me, watching all of this unfold from a distance, there was no sense of victory, no satisfaction in seeing them struggle. Because this was never about revenge, it was about truth. And truth doesn't exist to hurt people. It exists to reveal what was already there. The consequences weren't created by me leaving. They were created long before that, through patterns, through choices, through years of misunderstanding what respect actually looks like. And now those consequences were visible. Not as punishment, but as reflection. And sometimes that's the hardest thing to face. Because you can't argue with it. You can't ignore it. You can only decide what to do with it. And for the first time, they had to make that decision, without me there to carry it for them. What does your life look like when you finally stop shrinking to fit into places that never saw you clearly? Not perfect, not suddenly easy, but real, completely unapologetically real. That's where my story truly begins. My name is Cora Clark, and the night I walked away wasn't the end of something. It was the first time I stepped fully into my own life. The days that followed weren't dramatic. There was no instant transformation, no sudden moment where everything felt solved. Instead, there was space. Quiet, unfamiliar space where I had to learn who I was without constant expectations shaping every decision. At first, it felt strange, almost uncomfortable. I woke up the next morning without a list waiting for me, without messages telling me what needed to be done. For years, my time had never fully belonged to me. Now, it did, and I had to decide what to do with that. The contract with Meridian Corporation became the center of that new reality, not just because of its value, $240,000, but because of what it represented. It was something I had built on my own, something that existed entirely outside of my family's perception of me. I approached the work differently now, not with pressure to prove anything, but with clarity. Focus, ownership. Every decision I made felt intentional, not reactive, not shaped by someone else's urgency. For the first time, I wasn't splitting myself between two worlds. I was fully present in one. The meetings were different too. When I sat across from Christopher Hayes and his team, I wasn't carrying the weight of being misunderstood anymore. I wasn't trying to convince anyone that I belonged there. I already knew I did. And that changed everything. The way I spoke. The way I listened. The way I trusted my own ideas. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing your value without needing it to be confirmed. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't seek validation. It simply exists, and people respond to it, not because you ask them to, but because it's clear. Outside of work, things were still evolving. My phone stayed mostly quiet in those first weeks. No apologies, no dramatic attempts to fix what had happened, just distance. And honestly, that was exactly what I needed. Because healing doesn't happen in the same environment where the damage was done. It happens when you have enough space to see things without distortion, to understand what you experienced without immediately being pulled back into it. I thought about my family, of course, not constantly, not obsessively, but enough to recognize something important. I didn't hate them. I didn't even feel anger in the way I expected to. What I felt was clarity, a clear understanding of what I could accept and what I couldn't, of what I was willing to rebuild and what needed to remain separate. Because boundaries aren't about shutting people out completely. They're about deciding how close someone can come without harming you. And for the first time, I was making those decisions consciously. Not out of fear, not out of habit, but out of self-respect. The project moved forward, milestone by milestone, each step reinforcing something I had only started to believe that night. I was capable of building a life that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. A life where my work spoke for itself, where my time was respected because I respected it first. And as that reality became stronger, something else began to shift quietly in the background. Not around me, but within me. The need to be seen by people who had never truly looked started to fade, because I was no longer waiting for that moment. I had already found it. In my work, in my choices, in the way I showed up for myself every single day. And that's the part people don't always understand. The real transformation isn't external. It's internal. It's the moment you stop asking, why don't they see me, and start saying, I see myself. Everything else comes after that. The success, the recognition, the relationships that align with who you actually are. They're not the cause of that change, they're the result. And standing there weeks later, looking at the life I was building piece by piece, I realized something that felt both simple and powerful. I didn't lose anything when I walked away. I made space for everything I was meant to become. If this journey resonates with you, drop a like so more people can hear stories like this. Subscribe for more real stories about growth boundaries and choosing yourself, because sometimes one decision changes everything. What if the people who were supposed to love you slowly turned you into someone invisible, someone useful only when they needed something done, not with one cruel moment, not with shouting or fights, but with quiet expectations that never gave you a choice? My name is Cora Clark, and I was 28 years old, the weekend I realized I wasn't my family's daughter anymore. I was their unpaid help. It started with a message. No greeting, no question, just a command. My sister's birthday, 50 guests, and somehow, without anyone asking if I could, it all became my responsibility. I told myself it was temporary, that this is what family does, that helping meant being loved. But the reality felt different. Days blurred together as I cooked, cleaned, prepared everything alone, barely sleeping, barely eating, running on nothing but obligation and silence. Upstairs laughter filled the house while I stayed in the kitchen, hands covered in flour, moving faster just to keep up with expectations that never stopped growing. No one checked on me. No one asked if I was okay. And the worst part wasn't the exhaustion. It was how normal it felt, because deep down I had already accepted my role. The one who had time. The one who didn't complain. The one who could always be counted on, because she never said no. By the time the guests arrived, I hadn't even looked at myself in the mirror. I moved through the party like a shadow, serving food I made for people who didn't know my name in a house where I was supposed to belong. And standing there in the middle of everything I had built for them, I realized something that changed me forever. I wasn't helping my family. I was disappearing for them. It wasn't just one moment that broke me. It was years of being quietly overlooked, reduced, and compared, until I started questioning my own worth. My name is Cora Clark, and growing up, I learned something dangerous. No matter how hard I worked, it would never be enough if it didn't look like success in their eyes. My sister was the standard, the golden child, the future lawyer, the one everyone admired, celebrated, and proudly talked about. And me, I was creative, the one who had time, the one who could help. Every achievement I had somehow became smaller the moment it was placed next to hers. When I stayed up all night designing for family events, they praised her for organizing everything. When I landed my first paying client, they smiled politely, then immediately shifted the conversation to her unpaid internship like it mattered more. It wasn't loud disrespect. It was worse. It was subtle, consistent, and constant. The kind that slowly rewrites how you see yourself. Over time, I stopped sharing my wins. Stopped explaining what I did. Stopped expecting them to understand. Because every time I tried, it felt like my work was being translated into something smaller, something temporary, something optional. And the most painful part, I started to believe them. I started to think maybe my career wasn't real enough, important enough, valuable enough. That maybe I really was just the one with time, the one who could pause her life whenever family needed something. But here's the truth. No one tells you when people treat your work like it doesn't matter long enough. You either shrink to fit their version of you, or you finally see how wrong they've been all along. If you've ever felt compared, overlooked, or made to feel less than in your own family, comment "I feel this." Hit like if this resonates with you and subscribe. Because what happens next will show you exactly what it costs to stay silent for too long. If the biggest opportunity of your life arrived quietly while everyone around you was too busy, underestimating you to even notice. My name is Cora Clark, and while my family saw me as the one with too much time, I was secretly building something that could change everything. It started with an email I almost ignored, just another message in a crowded inbox, but something made me open it. Meridian Corporation. A name that didn't belong in my world, at least not the version of my life my family believed in. They had seen my work, not as a hobby, not as little freelance projects, as something valuable, something real. I didn't tell anyone, not my parents, not my sister, because I already knew how that conversation would go: polite smiles, quick nods, and then the spotlight shifting back to what they considered important. So I stayed quiet, and I worked. Days blurred into nights as I refined every detail, every concept, every line. I wasn't just trying to impress them. I was trying to prove something to myself, that I was more than the role I had been given. When the meeting came, my hands were shaking, but my voice didn't. I presented everything I had built in silence, knowing this was the moment that could either validate years of effort or erase it. And then something unexpected happened. They listened, not out of politeness, but with real attention. When I finished, there was a pause that felt endless. Then the CEO spoke. He said my work captured something they had been trying to define for years. Years. In that moment, everything shifted. Not because my family suddenly believed in me, but because I finally saw proof that I had been right all along. The offer came soon after. A full brand development contract worth $240,000. I stared at the number, reading it again and again, trying to understand how something so big could exist in the same world where I was treated like I had nothing going on. But I didn't tell them, not yet, because a part of me wanted something I had never received before. I wanted them to ask, have you ever been humiliated? Not in private, but in front of a room full of strangers, while the people who should protect you are the ones tearing you down. My name is Cora Clark, and that was the moment everything inside me started to break. The house was full, 50 guests' laughter, echoing through every room, glasses clinking, conversations flowing like I didn't exist. I had been on my feet since early morning, cooking, cleaning, carrying everything on my own. By the time the party reached its peak, I wasn't just tired, I was invisible. I stayed in the kitchen, moving between the stove and the sink, trying to keep everything perfect, hoping just once someone would notice. But when I finally stepped into the living room, it wasn't recognition I received. It was something else entirely. I heard my mother's voice before I saw her. Light, cheerful, almost proud. Cora's always been creative, she said. For a split second, I froze, thinking maybe, just maybe, this was the moment she would acknowledge me. Then she continued. She does little freelance projects from home. Little. That word hit harder than anything else. The room responded exactly how she expected: polite smiles, small nods, quick dismissal. Like she had just explained me away in one sentence. I stood there holding a tray, feeling something inside me collapse. Years of work, reduced to something small enough to ignore. Someone asked where I was, and my sister laughed softly. In the kitchen, where else the words weren't loud. They didn't need to be, because everyone understood. That was my place. Not beside them, not part of the conversation, just useful. I glanced across the room and saw him, Christopher Hayes, the man who had just offered me a contract worth $240,000, watching everything. Watching how I was being spoken about, watching how I was being treated. And in that moment, standing there with food in my hands and silence in my chest, I realized something I could never unsee again. It wasn't just that they didn't value my work, they had never even tried to understand it. What happens when the truth you've been carrying in silence finally comes out in the worst possible moment? Not planned, not controlled, just forced into the open when you've reached your limit. My name is Cora Clark, and that moment came in the middle of the kitchen with heat rising from the stove and pressure closing in from every direction. My sister walked in, stressed and patient, demanding the main course immediately. It wasn't ready, it needed time. But to her, timing didn't matter, only appearances did. Just figure something out, she snapped. Like the entire situation was my fault. I tried to stay calm, explaining, adjusting, doing what I had always done, fixing everything. But then she said it. It's not like you're dealing with real pressure. Something inside me went completely still. For years I had let comments like that pass, ignored them, minimized them. But not this time. Do you know what I'm working on right now? I asked. She barely looked at me. I don't have time for this. A contract, I said. That got her attention just enough. How big, she asked already, expecting something small, something she could dismiss. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't hesitate. $240,000. The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. For the first time she stopped, really stopped, turned toward me, like she was seeing someone new. What she whispered, I repeated it. Calm, clear, certain, full brand development contract. The shift in her expression was instant shock, disbelief, recalculation. Everything she thought she knew about me no longer made sense. She asked when it happened. I told her I'd been working on it for weeks, that I had tried to say I was busy, that she never asked. Silence filled the room. Not empty silence, but one filled with realization. And yet, even then, even after everything had been revealed, she looked at me and asked the one question that proved nothing had truly changed yet. You're still going to serve right? That was the moment I understood something clearly. Sometimes the truth doesn't change how people treat you, it just exposes who they've always been. What if the moment that changes your life doesn't come from winning, but from finally seeing yourself clearly for the first time? My name is Cora Clark, and that realization didn't happen in a meeting room or when I received the contract. It happened in a hallway in between being called back to serve and trying to remember who I was outside of that role. After everything that had just happened, I felt exposed, smaller than ever, until he spoke. Christopher Hayes didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He simply looked at me and said something that cut deeper than any insult I had heard that night. Talented people often get punished for being capable. I didn't respond at first, because I knew exactly what he meant. You're good at something, so people expect more from you. You don't complain, so they assume you don't mind. You're flexible, so they think your time doesn't matter. And slowly, without realizing it, you become the person everyone depends on, but no one truly sees. Capabilities shouldn't be confused with obligations, he added. That sentence stayed with me, because for the first time, someone wasn't just acknowledging my work, they were protecting its value. I had spent years trying to earn respect by doing more, giving more, proving more. But standing there, I realized something uncomfortable and freeing at the same time. The problem wasn't that I hadn't proven myself. The problem was that I had been proving it to the wrong people. People who had already decided what I was worth. People who never planned to change their minds. And in that moment, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. I stopped asking, why don't they see me? And started asking, why do I need them to? Because the truth is, once you see your own value clearly, you can't go back to pretending you don't. If this moment resonates with you, comment I see my value. Hit like if you've ever been taken for granted, and subscribe, because what happens next is the moment everything finally changes. What happens when you stop staying quiet? Not out of anger, but because silence is no longer something you can afford. My name is Cora Clark, and that moment didn't feel loud or dramatic. It felt clear. I walked out of the kitchen, not carrying a tray this time, not rushing to fix something, not trying to disappear. Just me. For the first time, I wasn't invisible. Conversations slowed as I stepped into the living room, voices fading into a quiet tension that filled the space. My mother smiled. The kind of smile meant to keep everything under control. Not now, she said softly, like she always did when something uncomfortable came up. But this time I didn't step back. No, I said, And even I could hear the difference. Not emotional, not reactive, just final. I spoke calmly, clearly not trying to hurt anyone, but refusing to protect the version of me they had created. I told them I had been working all day. That I wasn't just helping it, I was being expected to carry everything without being asked. That my work, my time, my effort had been dismissed for years. The room was silent now. Not polite. Silence. Real silence. The kind where people start to see what they've been ignoring. My sister tried to stop me. My father tried to move the conversation somewhere private, but I didn't follow. Where should we talk, I asked. Like every other time where nothing changes, I wasn't angry anymore. That surprised me, because anger would have been easier. This was something else. Clarity. I took off my apron and set it down. A simple action, but it felt like putting down years of expectation. I'm done, I said. Not with them, but with the role they had given me. When I turned toward the door, my mother's voice followed me. If you leave, don't come back. For a second, everything paused. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I understood exactly what that meant. Then I answered, okay. No argument, no explanation, just a boundary. And as I stepped outside, I realized something I had never fully understood before. Walking away doesn't mean you're giving up. Sometimes it means you're finally choosing yourself. What happens after you walk away is the part no one prepares you for. Not the moment of leaving, but everything that comes after. When the truth you expose doesn't disappear, it spreads. My name is Cora Clark, and while I was driving away that night, trying to process what I had just done, everything behind me was already starting to change. At first, it was subtle, the kind of shift you can't see immediately, but can feel in the air. The party didn't continue the way it was supposed to. Without me in the kitchen, everything slowed down. Dishes came out late. Conversations became awkward. The perfect image my family had built started to crack. People noticed. Not just the missing food or the delays, but the dynamic. The way I had been treated. The way no one stepped in, until I stepped out. And then the truth reached the one place my family cared about most, their reputation. Conversations didn't stay in that house. They moved outward. Among friends, colleagues, people who had been there and seen everything. Questions were asked. Judgments were formed. And suddenly the narrative they had controlled for years wasn't theirs anymore. It was everyone's. My sister felt it first. Not at home, but at work. Her competence wasn't questioned, but her judgment was. Because leadership isn't just about results, it's about how you see and treat people. And once that doubt exists, it doesn't disappear easily. My parents felt it differently, not through confrontation, but through distance. Invitations stopped. Conversations shortened. The confidence they once carried so easily began to fade. And me, I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel satisfaction. Because this was never about proving them wrong. It was about finally refusing to accept being seen that way. I signed my contract. I stepped into a life I had built quietly without their approval. And for the first time, I understood something that changed everything. Walking away didn't destroy my life. It revealed it. It showed me who I was, without their expectations, without their limitations, without their version of me. And that version was someone I was finally proud to be. What happens when the story doesn't end with walking away, but begins again with a choice? My name is Cora Clark, and the hardest part wasn't leaving, it was deciding what came next. Because freedom sounds powerful, until you realize it also means responsibility. No more excuses. No more waiting for someone to recognize your worth. Just you, your decisions, and the life you choose to build. The days after I left were quieter than I expected. No constant messages telling me what to do. No pressure to be available. Just space. At first, that space felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. For years, my time had never truly belonged to me. Now it did. And I had to decide what to do with it. I threw myself into my work not to prove anything anymore, but because I finally could. Every idea felt clearer. Every decision felt mine. When I walked into Meridian Corporation to sign my contract, I wasn't the girl from the kitchen anymore. I was the person I had been becoming all along. The difference was, now, I believed it. But healing isn't instant. Some nights I still replayed everything. The words. The silence. The moment I chose to leave. Not with regret, but with understanding. Because walking away didn't erase the past. It just gave me the power to stop living inside it. Weeks later, when my family finally reached out differently, quieter, more honest, I realized something else. Distance doesn't always end relationships. Sometimes it reveals whether they can change. And that was the real ending of my story. Not revenge, not victory, but choice. The choice to return on my terms, or not return at all. Because once you learn to see your own value clearly, everything becomes simpler. Not easier, but clearer. And clarity is what gives you the strength to build a life that finally feels like yours.